Welcome to the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I'm your host, Nicole Davidson, and in this podcast, we'll explore the art and science of negotiation in real-world situations. Whether you're negotiating a business deal, asking for a raise, or trying to resolve a conflict with a colleague or loved one, negotiation is an essential skill that can help you achieve your goals and build better relationships. Through interviews with experts, real-life stories, and practical tips and techniques, we'll deep dive into the strategies and tactics that can make you a better negotiator. From understanding your own negotiation style, to reading body language, handling difficult conversations, and overcoming common challenges, this podcast will give you the tools you need to negotiate with confidence and achieve your objectives. So whether you're a seasoned negotiator looking to refine your skills or someone who's new to the game, join us as we explore the world of negotiation in real life. In this episode of Negotiation in Real Life, I speak with Gary Schuller. Gary is a prolific speaker on how to make more sales, and he's the founder of the Business Marketplace Global and the Warrior Club. Gary created both of these businesses to help other businesses stand out from their competitors and be seen and heard. Gary had an epiphany in 2013 as he walked past the South Melbourne Market. What if there was a business marketplace with the hustle and bustle and excitement of a thriving market where people in business could meet, buy, sell, connect? That was the beginning of what is now the Business Marketplace Global phenomenon. Business Marketplace Global has been designed to serve and delight people in business to build their business. How, you may ask? The team at the Business Marketplace Global work for their members, building their business and providing a dynamic environment conducive to raising more invoices. It has a robust and proven formula and a system that drives it. In our discussion today, Gary and I speak about the importance of having a clear focus in your business, the problem of negotiating by telling, the power of the phrase, what would it take? Why you should ask, what do I have to do to win your business? Tips for effective business networking, how your vision statement can impact on your negotiations, and much, much more. As always, I hope you enjoy this episode. So Gary, welcome to the Negotiation in Real Life podcast.
Thank you, Nicole. It's exciting to be here with you.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to having a chat. We've had a brief chat before the podcast, and I know you've got some great stories to share. Before we get into those stories, I thought maybe you could introduce yourself to the listeners in terms of who you are and what you do.
So I started in business in 1986 with that old adage, be careful of what you want in life because you might just get it. And I had I had aspirations to hit the world circuit as a speaker in the area of negotiation. And within maybe 18 months, I'd had the ABC had done a documentary on me back to back with Tom Hopkins. I'd already written 3 books in a 2-year period, Bouncing Back, Bouncing High, and Dynamic Metamorphosis. I was on many radio stations and newspapers and many TV shows like Bert Newton, Don Lane, etc. And one of the things I realised then back in Australia then was that there weren't many international speakers from Australia. There were many we were importing in, but not many that we were exporting out. There were Alan Pease, Paul Dunn, Winston Marsh, and maybe another 10 or 15 guys and girls on top of that. And I joined that group. So success came relatively easy and enabled me to get on the world platform, as a speaker. But in 2013, I had an epiphany when I was running a workshop for a client. And I stopped and I said, I've got a problem. He said, what is it? I said, I'm more excited about your business than you are. And he nervously laughed. And as I left the workshop, I went to collect my car, which was parked at the South Melbourne Market. And I had one of those what-if moments. What if I could create an infrastructure that would be, exciting, like dynamic, like the market, where I could bring people in business together and act as the facilitator, connect them. Because what I found invariably, people would come and hear me speak to learn how to negotiate, but like most things, would do nothing with what they'd learned. And so fundamentally, you have to ask the question, why you're in business? You're in business to be a profitable business. So how do you make that happen? You got to write invoices. How do you get invoices? You got to have clients, customers, return business. So more recently, we went into that facilitation. So that's a very brief précis of from 1986 to now 2023.
Fantastic. And I love that idea that you wanted to build the expertise and the Australians that can share their expertise, because that for me mirrors what I've done in terms of this podcast, which is really trying to bring Australian negotiation stories to the Australian business community. So there's a bit of a match there, which is fabulous. So I'm really interested though, going back to those days where you wanted to build this presence as a speaker and talking about negotiation as your topic. What was it about negotiation that made you interested in that?
So prior to that, I had become a number one salesperson for a large organisation in England called Ryman Contract Stationery, which was predominantly door-to-door or office-to-office sales. And at the time, Ryman's had already been in business about 130 years. They're still in business, and they had mainly retail outlets. And they just created across England this new platform for salespeople like myself to be to go door to door, office to office. And I very quickly achieved great success. And in fact, one client called Marathon Oil, the one sale that I made called the Crumbs, enabled me to earn enough commission to purchase an apartment outside of London, a place called Uxbridge. But what I realised, to answer your question, when I then came back to Australia, and I used the word back because I actually schooled over here, I realised that most people had no idea how to negotiate. They were too busy telling people about what they could do and never took time out to establish the what, why, when, who, which, where. Tell me more about you. What are your pain points? What can I do to serve delight? What do you need this to do for you? Listen carefully, thread the conversation and say, if I can do what you've just told me and more, what would it take for you to consider having a further discussion? So I believed that was what was missing, and that's what I wanted to bring to the market, and that's what I did.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I think that transition from negotiating by telling people to understanding and listening and then coming up with shared proposals is probably the biggest thing. And it's still the thing that most people get wrong in a negotiation. What are some of the experiences that you had that brought you to that learning?
So if we go back to Marathon Oil, I was calling on that company every Tuesday at around 7 a.m. The buyer was a lady called Linda Shepherd, and she was already buying a lot of stationery because Ryman's were all into stationery off a competitor. And I must have gone for 6 consecutive weeks and nothing, no sale. And one day I just changed my conversation. I said, Linda, what would it take for me to win some business? She said, do you really want my business? I said, oh, absolutely. She said, come over here. This is my favourite pencil, she said. And she pushed down on the top and out bounced the lead. She said, your competitor, Cartwright Bryce, can't supply this, but if you can supply it, you'd be in my good books. Now, we were a massive organisation, but this was not one of our inventory products. But I learned to serve. And I went around all of London, found a little rickety old stationery shop, found the lead in there, bought it out of my own pocket, took it back, and she was delighted. The following week at 7 a.m, I turned up and she gave me an order for a box of envelopes. And the orders got bigger for about 5 or 6 weeks until eventually I learned to ask an even better question. Linda, when does my competitor come in and see you? She said, I was wondering when you'd ask me. She said, he comes in every Tuesday like you, but it's 6:30, half an hour before you. I said, well, when do you start? She said, I start at 6. I said, well, what if I come in next week at 6? She said, then you'll be half an hour ahead of him, won't you? So I did that, and the orders got bigger until one day my life changed. And I call this story the Crumbs, and you'll understand why. I went in, I said, she was really angry. You know, her face was red raw. And I said, Linda, what's the matter? She said, well, you wouldn't understand. And she said, I gave a massive order to Cartwright Bryce, your competitor. I've been told I can no longer buy stationery on an ad hoc basis. I've got to gut the whole of this building, which was huge, and basically buy a year's supply of stationery to produce, to give to all our satellite offices. And I gave the order to your competitor on the promise they could deliver, and they haven't. So I plucked up the courage. I said, well, can I have a look at the order? And it was reams and reams and reams of stationery. And I knew this was product we had. I said, well, we can supply this. And then she said, then you can have the order. Now, I want you to think this was back in late 70s, no mobile phones. What we used to have to do was run out to a phone box and ring the order through to head office. There was a little old lady in the phone box, so I had to grab her head butter and kick her out.
I'm going to hope that that's a joke.
Well, it was. I didn't headbutt her. I kicked her in the guts. But no, seriously, that one sale changed my life. Now, the moral to the story for your listener is I call it the Crumbs. Why? because I was serving and calling on that lady for many weeks with only initially some lead, which was worth like tuppence. But the perseverance, the asking of what would it take, what do I need to do, eventually got us the dividend. So the moral to the story is always ask, here's a tip for your listener. If nothing else, ask the following question: what do I have to do to win your business? If that's all they pick up from this today, that will already double their business potentially.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful question, isn't it? And it's one that I think people often don't feel that they are sort of empowered to ask. When you first started doing that, was there anything that got in the way, or, because you said that was a question that came to you, was there something that changed to suddenly bring that question into your mind?
Yes, I mean, I don't like the word cold calling. I prefer warm, but let's be honest, it was cold calling in those days. So you can imagine the receptionist was told, get rid of salespeople that are coming in without an appointment. So what I realized each time I went in and out of buildings talking to receptionists, they would all say thank you, but no thank you. So I learned to say, well, what do I have to do to basically get past you to speak to the person that makes the decision to purchase? And they would often say, well, you've got to make an appointment. Well, I'd say, how do I do that? Well, you've got to ring. Who do I ring? You ring me first. Here's my number, and I'll put you through. So I learned to listen, but more importantly, I learned to actually do what the person was telling me. So I learned to listen and then thread the conversation. So if I do what you've just told me, Mandy, as a receptionist, if I take this card away and ring you, as you said, on the preferred time you suggested, between 3 and 4 on a Tuesday, will you put me through? She'd invariably say, of course. So the lesson I learned there was cold calling was not easy. So you had to then understand, well, what is it? What's the barrier? What do you need to do to eradicate that? What does the receptionist want or not want? And once you got on with the receptionist, she would open the doors, or he would open the doors for many opportunities.
Which is a really important point, isn't it? Because in a negotiation, there's often multiple parties, and knowing who there is that has different amounts of power and different things that they can do, and where you can get friends along the way is a really important part of that process. And, I often hear people who aren't necessarily respectful to some of those people lower in the hierarchy, like the receptionist, and yet they're people who can make a significant difference in a negotiation.
Hugely. My father said to me, I remember my father committed suicide later in life, which was sad, but I'm
very sorry to hear that.
Yeah, he was very successful in a stationery company, and he said to me, he was always friends with the cleaner and whoever. And same when I worked at Ryman's, I made sure that the delivery men knew exactly where to go, how to get there, what to look for, because, they would often have to double park, blah, blah, blah. And the easier you made their life, the better they treated you. So as you say, negotiation isn't just about selling. It's actually a life skill. And my children, and I've got 4, my children, I brought them up to understand how to negotiate their way through any situation. There's a lovely little story about my youngest, Philippa. When she was 6, she came home one night very upset. And I said, what's the matter, sweetheart? She said, oh, my best friend won't speak to me. We had a fight. And I said, well, what happened? So she told me, and I said, how would you like to fix it? She said, I'd love to, Daddy. What do you propose? I said, well, what I'd like you to do tomorrow is go back. I can't recall her friend's name, so we'll call her Mandy. I'd like you to go and find Mandy and say, Mandy, what did I do to upset you? Listen to what she has to say, and then say, if I can rectify that, what would it take to be friends again? Now, it's a bit sophisticated, but in essence, that's really what we taught. And Philippa came home that night and she was rapt. She'd managed to rekindle that relationship by learning to ask that question. Yeah. So I'm a big believer that negotiation is a life skill, not a sales skill.
Oh, absolutely. And it's one of the things I love about being in this space is, whatever work I do, training people to negotiate doesn't just change their business outcomes, but it actually changes their relationships as well. And in fact, I think one of the nicest pieces of feedback I had was from somebody I saw about 6 months after a course, and they said, I'm so glad I did your course. It saved my marriage. So it is absolutely a life skill. Absolutely. I'm interested. You've talked quite a bit about examples where you've been able to go in and successfully negotiate. Have you had any negotiations where you've learned because things didn't go quite as well as you would have liked, and you've sort of taken away a life lesson from a negotiation that's gone wrong?
That's a great question. I mean, if I don't answer it with no, then people are going to think, well, that's not true. But it's really interesting because I can't actually recall. What I say to people is I always make 100% sale. The 100% means even if it's a no, it's a commitment to not waste each other's time to go further.
Yeah.
So the only time that I think, so I can't actually specifically address that for me, but what I would say is if you don't listen carefully, if you don't thread the conversation back, if you're not clear in your communications and, do exactly what the client has asked, then it can go pear-shaped. So when I use the word thread, this is a really important conversation because what happens often is people ask questions but they're not really listening. To know that you're listening is by threading the conversation. So I might say to you, tell me, one of the things that you find frustrating with dealing with X, Y, Z. And you might say, well, I've had some dreadful experiences like. So I'm listening. I go, wow, okay, it's interesting you mentioned that. When you say like, elaborate on that. So straight away, I'm threading my conversation back into what you've just told me to understand or to show and demonstrate to you that I'm actually listening to what you're saying. And that threading I find very rare nowadays. Even today, with all the technology we have, you'd think everyone would be in a much better place to negotiate. I think it's got worse.
I genuinely believe that our ability to have interpersonal communication and conversations is declining. That's a bit of a soapbox issue of mine. And particularly, I think, with younger generations who have grown up communicating via text message and communication apps rather than picking up a phone and speaking to each other. I look at, sometimes I look at my own children who are teenagers and their friends and their reluctance to actually pick up the phone and have a conversation to deal with a problem. That's something that's going to be an interesting thing to watch as we go through the next couple of decades, I think. And I'm still a big believer that we need to continue teaching. And I think more than ever, we need to teach these communication skills because adolescents aren't learning them the same way as they're growing up because they're doing their communication so much differently. And it's, they're not learning to manage conflict because it's very different managing conflict by sending emails or messages to each other than it is to actually have a difficult conversation. So there's a lot there. But going back to what you said, and I think there's one thing I wanted to really pick up on, you're talking about the fact that sometimes the negotiation was successful because you just didn't waste each other's time continuing a conversation that wasn't going to go ahead. And I think that's a really important point because a successful negotiation isn't always about getting a deal across the line. It's about getting the best deal. And if one of you is not able to provide somebody a deal that's better than they can get elsewhere, then it would be silly for a deal to be done. But minimising the amount of time that it takes to do that is a win. Other than that sort of general needing to listen to people, is there anything that you need to bring in terms of your mindset to be able to get to that place effectively?
Yes. So, for example, I know that you're part of a networking organisation, and one of the things that you'll find, I'm sure, is people say, "Oh, let's do coffee," and people go, "Okay," and I say, "Well, why would you do coffee? Why would I drive for an hour to meet you for a coffee, spend an hour with you, and then another 3 hours of my day to find out that there's nothing in common?" So, what I would say in that situation, love to do coffee, but before we do coffee, let's just understand exactly what we're going to be talking about when we have coffee. So, let me do a preempting conversation. And so you then would establish if there's an opportunity. Now that, because again, time is money. And I say to people, do you know what you're worth? Not what you get paid. What you get paid is different. You might be stacking baked beans for $20 an hour. That's what you get paid. But you could be worth $500 an hour. If you know what you're worth and you value that, then you would look at your time and consider that very precious. It's not to be have your nose, sticking up saying, I'm better than you. It's to say, look, happy to do coffee, but before we do that, let's clarify our understanding of what it is exactly we're going to meet about, what's the outcome we both want to potentially achieve, and then we can make a decision as to whether we could do it over a phone call first rather than, investing 3 hours of travel, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So that's another way of looking at how negotiation can often minimize wasting time or maximize opportunity, whichever way you want to look at it.
Yeah, I like that, because it's really about agreeing. Do we both have the same purpose? Are we having coffee because we're trying to identify opportunities to collaborate, or are we having coffee just because it's what's normally done, or because I'm looking for a friend? Or let's be on the same page about that. I think that's really good advice. And as you say, I mean, there are so many, particularly in the SME sector, so many businesses are running via networking groups of various types and activities, and you can meet a lot of people and end up wasting a lot of time if you don't negotiate what's the purpose of this call. So I think that's really great advice for small businesses.
Yeah, and look, again, as I said, if you look at most people at these types of events, they'll have a coffee without even asking what it's about. And it's because they're almost, and I say it lovingly, they're almost desperate just to have somebody talk with them. And you really got to take a stance, and it comes back to vision, mission, and purpose. What's your vision? Where are you going? What's your mission? How are you going to make that happen? And what's your purpose? Why do you do what you do? So, for example, our vision statement is the business marketplace global is the greatest connector on the planet. The key word in that sentence is the word is, not futuristic. It's present tense. Now, why I share that with you and your listener is because when you stick to your vision statement, everything you do comes back around, is this going to actually take me closer and farther up the road to where we want to go? And if the answer is no, that's okay, then maybe we're not the right fit. So it comes back to asking those questions, really.
Yeah, fantastic. So if you were to leave one point for listeners in terms of the biggest thing that will make a difference to their negotiation outcomes, and we've probably touched on it already, but what would be your sort of key piece of advice for somebody wanting to become a better negotiator?
Well, so for example, if you and I are meeting for the first time and I'm effectively wanting to introduce you into a product or service I'd like you to eventually buy, you would probably say to me, tell me about your product. And the temptation there is to go, okay, what we do is, and we've been in business and we're the greatest and we're the best and blah, 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 blah. And you're yawning and falling asleep thinking about dinner. So the first thing I'd say is I'd love to do that, Nicole. But before I do that, tell me, what interest do you have in this particular industry or product or service? What experience have you had? What have you, who do you currently use? How do you find them? Blah, blah, blah. Now, what I'm doing there is I'm turning that into a conversation about you rather than about me. So you might say, well, to be honest, Gary, we've had some really interesting experiences with people that like yourself, and this is what we found, and this is some of the pain points, and this was some of the outcomes. I'm listening now and saying, okay, that's great. So let me clarify. If we could introduce you to a solution that would minimize what you've just said was dreadful and maximize the opportunity, would you be interested in discussing it further? Well, the answer would have to be yes, because I've now taken time out to understand what you want or what you don't want. So the answer to your question for your listener is make a stance. Don't get straight into what you can do for somebody because you don't know what you can do for them. Ask the question, what, why, when, who, which, where, how. Tell me about you. And then listen, thread the conversation and ask the better question. If I can, would you consider discussing it further? That becomes a gateway to a great opportunity.
Fabulous piece of advice. So, Gary, I've enjoyed our conversation. If listeners wanted to learn more about you or have a chat to you about your advice, obviously negotiating whether it's a purposeful conversation or not, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
The Business Marketplace Global is our website, and if they go there, they'll find some great testimonials and a little bit of information about us, the businessmarketplaceglobal.com. I emphasize the businessmarketplaceglobal.com, and that will give them great information about who we are, what we do, and how we might be able to serve them. And of course, like I just said, to practice what I preach, we can't assume we can serve until we've had a conversation.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today, Gary. I've really appreciated our conversation and enjoyed chatting with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Nicole. Thank you.
Pleasure. That's all for this episode of the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and learned something new that you can apply in your own negotiations. Remember, negotiation is a skill that can be developed and refined over time, so keep practicing and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us on social media or email us directly. And if you liked this episode, please leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It helps us to reach more people and continue to produce high-quality content. Until next time, keep negotiating in real life.